Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. Justin, we're going to talk about mineral rights news for February of 2024. And like we were talking about before we hit record, there's an interesting mix of articles this month and a lot of political issues that are popping up.
You said it, Matt. For whatever reason, who knows? It looks like it's an election year if you're looking at the news cycle here.
Yeah. If you didn't know any better, you would wonder why all this stuff is being talked about, and that is a great explanation for it. And I think that leads pretty well into that first article. Do you want to go ahead and talk about that?
Let's do it, Matt. So Biden stalls natural gas exports that activists call climate bombs. This is an article by the Washington Post. It goes on to say President Biden decisively in favor of climate activists fighting new fossil fuel development on Friday, deciding to pause the approval of new liquefied natural gas projects because of their danger to the planet, even in the face of criticism that it could hurt the U.S. energy business. And Matt, this is a pretty big situation here. The administration's decision has cast uncertainty over a mammoth LNG project on the Louisiana coast, known as CP2. The project is closer to becoming operational than 9 other proposed LNG terminals, since it's already secured financing and customers and is waiting federal permits. And Matt, it goes on to talk about some of the future projects as well in this article, but this could have a major effect on the economy. I mean, the industry's really been waiting for these export terminals to come online to kind of balance supply and demand issues.
Yeah, exactly. We've talked about this a lot on this show, that we're really dependent at this point on the LNG export capacity to balance supply and demand here in the United States, because there is a glut of gas. In other words, we have more gas than we can use ourselves. And so the prices have been buoyed over the last couple of years by all of these LNG export terminals that have been built along the Gulf Coast and on the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. And what it does is it allows us to export our gas. So they have basically the ability to compress and refrigerate this gas and put it on these tankers, send it over to Europe and other places that don't have as much gas that need it. And we can sell it for a price arbitrage. So that's one of the real big drivers for these facilities is, natural gas here is trading for less than $3 per 1,000 cubic feet here in the United States. The prices have historically been 2 to 3 times, maybe even more. We saw last year during the winter in Europe that it was significantly more. And so basically companies can lock in the price over there, in Europe or in Asia and make the difference that otherwise they'd be having to sell it for a lot less here in the US. And so when we look at natural gas prices in the future, all of the forecasts of natural gas going up starting in 2025 is totally dependent on the new LNG export capacity coming online and then at that time frame. And so this isn't going to affect those existing projects that are under construction that already have permits, and that's what the government said. But they did throw a wrench in a lot of these projects that haven't made the final investment decision or just are pretty far along in that planning process, just waiting on permits or applying for permits. And that CP2 is kind of the one that was the first in line, it sounds like. And I looked at the numbers, I was curious if this CP2 project gets delayed because of this federal moratorium on permits, it would be equivalent of taking off about 2.68 BCF of natural gas per day in export capacity that would have come online, I think in 2026 was their original plans. So not an immediate impact that we would see, but I think if we were forecasting natural gas production to continue slowly rising, I saw an article also that we just recently hit an all-time high in terms of natural gas production. And so as that trend sort of stays around that level or creeps up, we're going to need this extra export capacity. Otherwise, prices are going to just tank. So I think from a mineral and royalty owner perspective, the thing to pay attention to is how long this permitting moratorium stays in effect, because that will determine the impact on some of these projects that are waiting for these permits. Now, some of these other projects that are maybe not as far along in the process, they probably have 6 months, 12 months before they're applying for permits. And hopefully this will be resolved before then so that those projects can continue as planned. Assuming that the companies continue to move forward with those projects. Now, this could have a negative impact on the timing of any new facility that isn't permitted because they may put a hold on that and say, well, we're going to wait and see what the government does before we make any decisions. And there's obviously a political driver of this. It was clearly stated in this Washington Post article that it was catering to the climate activists that have been calling for this for a while. And in an election year where they're trying to secure votes and try to cater to their quote unquote base, which it's hard to see who that is anymore with either party. But in any case, I think this is a very politically motivated decision and a negative impact on mineral and royalty owners if it stays into effect for too long, because it will negatively impact our ability to get rid of the gas. And if we can't sell it to Europe and Asia and other places like that, then the prices are going to go down. It's just going to be an oversupply situation. And so that, supply and demand stands to reason the prices will fall.
You said it, Matt. And like you said, it'll be interesting to see if this gets rectified over time. And I'm sure that the oil and gas company is going to be really championing to get this moved along to help balance that supply and demand. And speaking of supply and demand, our next article here is talking about lithium and why lithium prices crashed by 80%. Demand growth has slowed while stockpiles of battery metals have increased, putting downward pressure on lithium prices. Lithium prices crashed last year by over 80% to the lowest level since 2020 at $13,200 per ton. In China alone, there appears to be a surplus of over 200 gigawatt hours of lithium-ion batteries last year. And Matt, those are almost funny numbers. It's really hard to put that into perspective.
Yeah, it's hard to put that in perspective. And you made a great point that I hadn't really thought of. And first, I picked this article because I was surprised to see this after hearing about a lot of the excitement and focus put on developing lithium here in the US, especially with mining lithium through the brine that is produced with oil and gas. And so this produced water that has lithium in the brine itself. And we've heard, we reported on this last month with Arkansas and East Texas seeing a big focus, and with ExxonMobil leasing up a bunch of land and starting to drill some wells to extract lithium. And this article saying, wait, hold on, prices are crashing and all this stuff. And you brought up a good point that there is speculation that China might be overstating the lithium reserves that they have for the sole purpose of crashing the market to damage foreign investment into lithium mining, because effectively they have a monopoly on this. And so that is something that I think is interesting and something that worth considering. We'd have to do some more research to see, because this article doesn't go into that much depth into the amount of lithium that China has, but I think that is a big factor, to take into consideration. So whether or not that's actually true that they have as much surplus lithium there or not is a big question.
You nailed it, Matt. And, this is kind of a play out of the playbook from China. And it certainly could have an impact on the American market that is seeking investment to really get started in extracting for lithium. As you mentioned, Matt, they were making some big moves and shakes in Arkansas.
Yeah, big shakes. And I think it's already having the intended consequence if that is what China is doing here. This article quotes several companies that said they were rephasing larger projects, they're planning job cuts, they're deferring spending, they're basically just trying to stay afloat during these low prices. And so it's going to slow down the investment in lithium extraction. So, interesting that is going on, amidst the focus and amidst the demand for lithium ion batteries for cars and things like that. Sounds like maybe things have shifted a little bit, and it could be that we actually are getting ahead on the supply side. The demand is falling, less demand for EVs and things like that. So yeah, something to keep an eye on if you are in an area that has a lot of lithium potential or lithium exploration going on, to see if that affects the plans of those operators.
And our next article here it looks like New Mexico is taking a play from Colorado on this. And the title here is Controversial Proposed Oil and Gas Bill Passes Its First Committee, a bill that would make the most significant changes in decades to a nearly 90-year-old state fossil fuel law, starting a lengthy and heated discussion among lawmakers about increasing regulation on an industry that generates roughly 40% of New Mexico's tax revenue. And Matt, the article goes on with a little bit more detail about opposing sides, but essentially it would eliminate the cap on penalties imposed on rule breakers and increase the maximum bonding amounts that drillers pay upfront as insurance to $10 million from the current $250,000. And Matt, Colorado did this. I guess it was last year when they went through this. And it's a hard question to answer as to what the right thing to do is. Having orphaned wells is certainly not sustainable. However, increasing the bond limit so drastically is just going to push out the small mom and pop operators in New Mexico.
Yeah, you're right about that. I think that it will hurt some of those smaller operators that just frankly aren't going to be able to afford to put up the additional money, which, to your point, is perhaps an indication that there is a risk there that those wells that they operate could become orphan wells. And so what the state is trying to do is to prevent that. The question becomes, what is the right balance around how much they need to have from a bonding standpoint to ensure that if those wells were to become orphan wells, that the state would be able to cover the plugging and abandonment of those wells without having to foot the bill. The other thing that this bill does is it would codify the state's waste rule, requiring companies to capture 98% of their methane by 2026, which I think is good. And again, thinking about this from like a royalty owner perspective, we would want all of that methane to stay in the pipe, go through the meters, and you get paid for that. Any methane that gets released into the atmosphere, we're not getting paid for. And obviously, it has some negative environmental consequences as well. So those types of rules, I think, are good. And I think giving the operators a couple of years to get things put in place is good. We've seen this in Colorado. They've already gone down the road of requiring very strict methane rules, monitoring and all that kind of stuff. And it's been successful, I think. And I think it's, that's the right thing to do. And it just helps, again, royalty owners because we're getting paid for all of the gas that gets produced. And so that it doesn't get vented or flared or whatever. The thing that is interesting, though, it does quote a small operator here. It says this oil and gas act under consideration would decimate my company, said Jerry McHugh, Jr., owner of San Juan Resources, which operates 40 wells. I could not afford to stay in business. It's a matter of too little capital to meet these stratospheric requirements. On the flip side of that, not too surprising that some of the largest operators, some of the majors like Occidental and EOG expressed support for the bill. And Patrick Padilla, director of EOG's regulatory affairs, said making it a law for operators to capture 98% of their methane would allow the industry to show strides it has made in using more efficient technology. So I think I agree with that sentiment that it is demonstrating that we do care about the environment. We want to keep it in the pipe, but it's easy for them to say because they're already doing these types of things. And so this is often what you see with these major oil and gas operators is they're usually in the forefront of putting stricter environmental controls in place and trying to do the right thing because they have the deep pockets, right? They have both the scale to where keeping that extra couple of percent of gas in the pipe means like they're making that much more in sales. So that's like, okay, we can do this. We have the expertise, we have the technology, we have the scale to buy the equipment at a discount because we're buying a lot of it. And so it's cheaper for them to implement these types of controls and do all this kind of stuff. And it's sort of frankly, it's kind of a little bit of like a regulatory moat that they're putting around their operations. You have these regulations that come out that they can meet pretty easily. And it prevents some of these smaller operators from infringing into their territory from that standpoint. So that's a little bit of a competitive advantage for some of these larger companies. And again, they oftentimes have hundreds of wells anyway, so they're already at the max bonding requirement, and $10 million versus $250,000 for a company that makes billions a year like EOG or Oxy. It's a drop in the bucket. They'll just say, sure, fine, we'll sign that check. And so, yeah, I struggle with it because I do agree with you. We need to prevent orphan wells, but we also don't want to put the small mom and pop operators out of business just by the fact that we're passing a law that nobody can meet unless you're like a major oil and gas company.
You said it, man. And speaking of Colorado here, so in 2019, there was a bill passed, 19-181, a package of drilling reforms by the Colorado Democrats. And part of that was a mandate for the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to evaluate and address the potential cumulative impacts of oil and gas development, Matt. And it sounds like that is coming full circle, and it's in the news again on the beginning to do that. And Matt, this is very different than the way that they've looked at this before. Looking at the cumulative really looks at the entire lifespan of the well and kind of widens the different regulations that an operator must meet. And so, Matt, it'd be interesting to see. This was something that was known was coming, but it sounds like for about 5 years, it really wasn't talked about a whole lot.
Yeah, and I think they were getting a lot of those other rulemakings complete now that all that other stuff is done. And the deadline that was imposed on the ECMC was the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, when they had legislation that was passed that basically told the commission they needed to put something in place to define those rules, taking into account the cumulative impacts on air quality, water quality, climate, noise, odor, wildlife, and biological resources. And the interesting thing about this, and I need to learn more about it and see if this is going to be a beneficial thing, or is it more aimed at just slowing down and limiting oil and gas development? Because those impacts are considered for any permit. They have to consider biological resources, wildlife, and habitat, and making sure that they're not going to adversely affect any endangered species, anything like that. And then, of course, with the community, with the 19181 requirement that they get local input on any permits and any development plans, that effectively takes into account the noise and odor side of things, the air quality and all of that on the residents and other people that live nearby. And so when we look at cumulative impact, I think they're really thinking, okay, you have these taking each facility on a one-off basis, and then this cumulative side of things is saying, okay, for this area, let's look at all of this. What does the existing footprint look like on all those things I mentioned, like air quality, water quality, climate, noise, et cetera? And then if we add this other facility in here, how's that going to affect things? So I don't know. I have a feeling that this can be potentially good if the rules itself are workable and are fact-based and not something where it becomes a subjective decision in terms of allowing NGOs and others that just want to shut down the industry to come in and rally the troops and have a bunch of public comment from people that are not going to be directly affected by it just to get the project shut down. I think that would be bad. If it is something where we make smart decisions, like an ozone non-attainment area, like in the Denver Front Range in the summer, in order to keep drilling, that operators have to use electric rigs or electric frac fleets, that could be a good thing, right? So I don't see any other industry as progressive as the oil and gas industry in terms of reducing emissions. And I think that, like we talked about before we hit record, Justin, it would be interesting if these same type of requirements were placed on residential and commercial developers and others that are using heavy equipment in the summer to construct, apartment complex, to construct a shopping center. Right next door, there's a well pad being built. And if they're not allowing oil and gas companies to do any work because summer ozone season, that is hypocritical, and they should be applying the same rules to everybody. And if you're building an apartment complex, you need to use an electric bulldozer if that's what it means, then so be it. And same with the drilling well pad. So I think that's my real concern, Justin, is that we're having these very different rules placed on oil and gas industry as to other industries, which really seem to be never getting the same kind of focus.
You said it, man. And it'll be really interesting to see how they decide to utilize this framework. As you mentioned, this could easily be one of those situations where it's set up, it becomes workable. But if we have a new political group come in, it could easily get changed to become something that's not workable. And I'm interested to see how the operators respond to this and which side of this they stand on.
Yeah, I think everybody needs to do their part. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're keeping the air clean, the water clean, and that's important to everybody. It's just we need to make sure it's not done in a politically driven way. It needs to be done in a fact-based and science-based way, which I think the ECMC is usually pretty good about doing. And I think there is a public comment period. I know the industry is heavily involved with providing input to make sure that the plans are workable. So I'm hopeful that will continue to be the case with these cumulative impact rules, just to make sure that we're not going to be providing overly restrictive requirements that can't be met when we look to develop oil and gas resources in urban areas like in the Colorado Front Range, which is sort of the forefront and really the reason, I think, for this particular rule.
You said it, man. All right. So rig count. Looks like we're up 2 for the week. But Matt, this looks like quite a bit of shuffling going on. We're up 1 unit in Utah, 1 unit in Wyoming. Looks like in Texas, they shuffled a few around. It says there's 3 more in the Permian Basin. It looks like we lost some in some of the other major plays.
Yeah, stuff moving around, but I thought it was interesting to see an uptick, which is cool. I think we were at, like you said, Justin, 600 a week ago, and now it's 602. So, flattening out, maybe going up a little bit. I think that maybe supports the thesis we had at the end of last year that companies were kind of coming up against their capital budgets. We're having to cut spending just for the end of the year, and then we're going to pick up a rig again in the spring. So, yeah, good to see that. In fact, our neck of the woods here in Colorado, the DJ Basin was up 1 rig, which is great to see. And then the Permian also up 3. Continues to lead the way in terms of drilling activity.
You said it, man. And let's hope that the price of oil goes up or at least stays stable. I'm sure we won't see any massive expansion in new rigs until we have some sustained oil prices for a bit of time.
That's a great point. And talking to some of the other people in the industry, I've heard that if crude falls below $70, to expect a large decrease in capital spending. There's like a tipping point, I think, from that $70 a barrel. Below that, the project economics for a lot of these wells are negative, and so they can't afford to go and develop those interests at those prices. So, I think as long as we see oil above $70, and as we're recording this, a little bit above $77 per barrel for WTI, and a little bit less than $2.50 for natural gas, which is not too surprising to see natural gas down. It's down 10%. In fact, I think, which is probably a lot to do with the Biden ruling on the LNG export. And I think that could put some downward pressure on natural gas here for part of the year as we kind of navigate that and see how that's going to affect those new facilities. So,
all right, Matt. Well, that wraps it up for February of 24 news here.
All right. Yeah. Thanks again for listening. If you come across an article you'd like us to cover, just send an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.